T30, 75 tons of fury, and the most powerful gun in U.S. heavy tank history. The summer of 1944 turned into a nightmare for American tankers who had landed on the Normandy coast. Crews of Sherman medium tanks, which had recently been successfully defeating Italians and Germans in North Africa, suddenly encountered an enemy against which their machines proved practically helpless. From dense French groves and from behind stone walls of Normandy villages, German Tiger heavy tanks and the newest King Tigers opened fire on American columns, whose frontal armor reached 150 millimeters. The 76 millimeters shells from Shermans bounced off these steel monsters like peas off a wall, while in response came 88 millimeters rounds that pierced American machines clean through. Within a few weeks of fighting, hundreds of burning Shermans littered the picturesque Normandy fields, and United States Command finally realized the scale of the catastrophe. The problem was that American generals had rested on their North African laurels for too long. Successes in Tunisia and Sicily convinced them that medium tanks could handle their tasks well enough, and that heavy machines represented only an expensive and unwieldy burden for advancing armies. The M6 heavy tank program, developed at the beginning of the war, was effectively frozen after these cumbersome machines performed extremely poorly in trials. Weighing almost 60 tons, the M6 had weak armament for its class and suffered from constant transmission breakdowns. Therefore, Command waved off heavy tanks and focused on mass production of Shermans. This mistake cost the lives of thousands of American tankers during the summer months of '44. Panic gripped American military leadership at the end of July, when it became finally clear that existing equipment couldn't stand on equal footing against German heavy tanks. Urgent meetings followed one after another. Generals demanded immediate solutions, and designers frantically searched for ways to somehow fix the situation. The first idea was deep modernization of the ill-fated M6, designated M6A2E1. The proposal was to install a new turret with a powerful 105 mm gun on the old chassis. However, General Lucius Clay sharply opposed this project. He correctly pointed out that the modernized machine would weigh about 77 tons while retaining all the defects of the original design, including abysmal mobility and unreliable running gear. On August 14, 1944, at another meeting, a proposal was first voiced to create a completely new heavy tank, designated T29. This machine was to combine a chassis inspired by the design of the promising T26 with the turret and armament from the M6A2E1. The 105 mm T5E1 gun could theoretically defeat German Tigers at decent ranges. However, some specialists immediately had serious doubts. The main opponent of the future tank would be the King Tiger with its 150 mm frontal plate, and not everyone believed that a 105 mm gun could reliably penetrate such protection. It was at this moment that a project destined to become the most powerful tank in the history of American tank building of that period came to light. On the same day, August 14, a decision was made for parallel development of another machine under the designation T30. The hull and turret of this tank were to be identical to the T29. However, the armament was planned to be of a completely different level. Instead of a 105 mm gun, designers proposed installing a 155 mm caliber weapon, created based on the famous long-range howitzer known by the nickname Long Tom. This was a true monster, whose shell weighed 43 kilograms and could turn any enemy tank into flaming debris regardless of its armor thickness. Work on the T30 officially started on September 14, 1944. Initially, only 2 prototypes were planned, as Command viewed this machine more as a backup option and testing platform for the super-powerful gun. Unlike the T29, which was planned for serial production of 1,000 units, the T30 was never intended for mass production. However, the engineers who received the assignment to develop this steel giant couldn't imagine what technical problems they would have to overcome and how much time creating the most powerful American tank of that era would take. The gun that was to turn the T30 into the deadliest tank of its time had a rich combat history even before being adapted for installation in a turret. The M101 howitzer, nicknamed Long Tom among artillerymen, was developed in the late 1930s to replace the obsolete 155mm M1918 gun, which was a copy of a French Terroristics, and in its capabilities approached the Soviet 152mm gun of special power, the BR-2. The initial shell from the American gun was slightly lower, and the shell itself slightly lighter. However, overall both systems demonstrated comparable effectiveness. At the same time, the Soviet Union produced only 39 BR-2 guns, while American industry from October 1940 to June 1945 produced 1,882 Long Toms. Practically no major operation in North Africa and Europe took place without the participation of these powerful artillery systems. For tank installation, the gun had to be seriously reworked. The barrel was shortened to 6,414mm, which was 41.4 calibers. The initial shell velocity was reduced to 717 meters per second. However, even in this form, it was the most powerful tank gun ever created in the United States at that time. The new gun received the designation T7 and could use several types of ammunition. The ammunition load included T30 armor-piercing shells with high-velocity cores, M112B1 and T29 armor-piercing cumulative shells with protective caps, M107 high-explosive fragmentation shells, and M110 smoke shells. Any of these shells could send an enemy tank to oblivion, whether Tiger, Panther, or even the most powerful King Tiger. However, this gun had a significant drawback related to ammunition size. Each shell weighed 43 kilograms, and the powder charge added another 18 kilograms, so the full weight of a round reached 61 kilograms. No person could single-handedly lift and load such ammunition in the cramped space of a tank turret. Therefore, designers had to provide for two loaders in the crew. One operated a special lifting mechanism that extracted the shell from the ammunition rack and fed it to the breech, while the second activated a spring rammer that pushed the ammunition into the chamber. Even with coordinated work of both loaders, the rate of fire didn't exceed 2 shots per minute with manual loading, which was extremely low for tank combat. The size of the gun and ammunition required creating a completely new turret with a high rounded profile. Only such a design allowed placing 2 loaders inside who had to work standing at full height. At the same time, loading was only possible at certain barrel elevation angles, which imposed additional limitations on combat. Frontal turret armor reached 203 to 305 millimeters depending on the section. Side armor was 158 millimeters and rear 102 millimeters. Such protection made the T30 practically invulnerable to most enemy anti-tank weapons when attacking head-on. The tank hull was protected no less impressively. The upper frontal plate had a thickness of 102 millimeters and was positioned at a rational angle of inclination, which significantly increased its shell resistance. Hull sides were covered by 76 millimeters armor, and the rear by 51 millimeters. All this magnificence, combined with the massive turret, heavy gun, and ammunition load of 32 shells, brought the machine's mass to 75,800 kilograms. For comparison, the T29 tank, with its 105mm gun, weighed 64,183 kilograms, almost 12 tons less. The weight difference was explained, but also by the increased ammunition load of the T29, which carried 63 shells, with 2 machine guns. Besides the main gun, the tank was enemy manpower, while a 7.62mm M1919A4 Browning hull machinger commanded 19A4, and radio operator gunner who controlled the hull machine gun. Creating a tank weighing almost 76 tons posed a most serious task for engineers, where to find an engine capable of moving this steel mountain and ensuring acceptable mobility on the battlefield. Initially, it was planned to use a 27-liter Ford Gas gasoline engine, developing 770 horsepower. This same motor was intended for the T29 tank, and unification of power plants seemed a reasonable solution from the standpoint of simplifying production and spare parts supply. However, the first calculations showed that the specific power was depressingly low. For a 75-ton machine, 770 horsepower meant just over 10 horsepower per ton of weight, which threatened to turn the tank into a sluggish turtle unable to keep up, even with infantry. By the end of 1944, the situation with the heavy tank program changed dramatically. It became obvious that neither the T-29 nor the T-30 would have time to participate in the war against Germany. Allied forces were confidently advancing toward the borders of the Reich, and although German heavy tanks still represented a serious threat, the overall course of hostilities was developing in favor of the anti-Hitler coalition. Order volumes for new heavy machines were reduced, but no one was going to completely shut down the program. Instead, designers got the opportunity to not rush and bring the projects to perfection, eliminating identified deficiencies. It was then that a decision was made to replace the power plant. Instead of the Ford gas, they decided to install a 29-liter air-cooled Continental AV1790 engine on the tank, which could develop up to 810 horsepower. An increase of 40 horsepower may seem insignificant, but the new motor had several important advantages. Air cooling made it less vulnerable to combat damage, since there was no complex system of pipelines and radiators that could easily be pierced by shrapnel or a bullet. Furthermore, the Continental engine was distinguished by greater reliability and maintainability, which was critically important for such a heavy and complex machine. The specific power of the T30 with the new engine was 10.68 horsepower per ton, which was practically identical to the T29 E3 tank indicator of 10.74 horsepower per ton. Simultaneously, the transmission was also replaced. After long trials and comparisons, the choice fell on the CD 851 automatic transmission, which provided smooth gear shifting and reduced the load on the driver mechanic. Operating a 76-ton machine required enormous physical effort from the driver, and any easing of his work directly affected the combat capability of the tank as a whole. The turret also underwent serious reworking. Initially, it was planned to install on the T30 a turret developed for the modernized M6A2E1, which was called the T29 type turret. However, during testing and mock-up work, serious problems with protection were revealed. It turned out that through vision slits and technological openings, bullets and small fragments could penetrate inside the turret, creating mortal danger for the crew. Designers set about reworking it, and ultimately the turret changed so substantially that only the general concept remained from the original project. Nevertheless, the turrets of the T29 and T30 tanks remained unified, differing only in the number of coaxial machine guns and the gun mount, which received the designation T124, while engineers worked on improving the design. In spring 1945, the last battles in Europe thundered. On May 8, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender, and the war on the Western Front ended. The main enemy against which the T30 was created ceased to exist. However, fierce fighting with Japan continued in the Pacific. American command seriously prepared for the invasion of the Japanese islands, and heavy tanks with the most powerful armament could be useful for storming enemy fortified positions. The first T30 prototype was completed in March 1945 and received registration number USA 30,160,842. At the end of March, the machine was sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Nagasaki, put an end to World War II. Japan capitulated, and the need for heavy tanks for assault operators as the machine represented enormous interest as a testing platform for working out new technical solutions. Contrary to the widespread misconception that only 2 T30 prototypes were built, documents testify to something completely different. By May 1947, 6 machines had appeared with registration numbers from USA 30,162,842 to USA 30,162,847. Each of these steel giants received its own fate and made its contribution to the development of American tank building. All machines were fitted with the improved Continental AV1795-3 engine, developed parallel to the tank itself and distinguished by increased reliability compared to the base version. 5 of the 6 prototypes went to Aberdeen Proving Ground, which became the main site for testing American armored vehicles. Tank number 3 remained at Detroit Arsenal, where it was turned into a stationary testing laboratory for working out various technical solutions. This machine never left the factory walls and was used exclusively for bench testing of individual units and assemblies. The remaining 5 tanks awaited a much more dynamic life filled with thousands of kilometers of travel on various roads and off-road. However, not all machines stayed long at Aberdeen. On June 8, 1948, tank number 5 was loaded onto a railway platform and sent to Fort Knox, the famous repository of America's gold reserve, where a large military proving ground was also located. On July 23% of the same year, tank number 6 departed in the opposite direction to the testing base in Yuma, Arizona, where the machine was to be tested in conditions of extreme heat and desert terrain. And on January 20, 1949, tank number 4 crossed the United States border and headed to Canadian Fort Churchill for winter testing in Arctic cold conditions. Before shipment to Canada, tank number 4 underwent break-in at Aberdeen, racking up 213 kilometers on the odometer. Already at this stage, mechanics discovered defects in the transmission that had to be eliminated before the long journey. Canadian frosts were to be a severe exam for all systems of the machine, especially for the air-cooled engine, whose operation at temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius caused justified concerns. The results of winter testing showed that the Continental AV-1790 handled Arctic cold significantly better than the competing Ford gas installed on T29 tanks. Tank number 6, sent to scorching Yuma, also required mechanics' attention even before the start of desert tests. Some engine components had to be replaced before the machine could begin trials. Additional tests took place from October to December 1948, and based on their results, the transmission had to be completely replaced. In 1949, this tank was fitted with the improved CD 853 gearbox, which proved significantly more reliable than its predecessor. The true record holders among the prototypes were tanks number 1 and number 2, which remained at Aberdeen and underwent the most intensive testing program. The first machine accumulated 800 kilometers of mileage, of which 142.5 kilometers fell on tests with the CD 852 transmission. But the absolute record among all American experimental heavy tanks was set by tank number 2. This machine covered a total of 3,706 kilometers, of which 1,492 kilometers were traveled with the CD 852 transmission. During testing, the engine and transmission had to be replaced repeatedly. However, the overall picture favored the Continental power plant, which demonstrated far greater reliability compared to the Ford gas. The results of months of testing allowed an unambiguous conclusion. The Continental AV-1790 air-cooled engine surpassed its competitor in all key parameters. It proved more powerful, more reliable, and simpler to maintain. And most importantly, it worked equally well in both the Arctic cold of Canada and the scorching heat of the Arizona desert. This victory in comparative trials determined the future of American tank building for a decade ahead. Already in 1949, production began of the M46 medium tank, on which the Continental AV-1795 3-engine and CD 853 transmission worked out on heavy prototypes were installed. This same combination migrated to the T-43 heavy tank, which later became the famous M103, which became the foundation of United States heavy tank forces during the Cold War years. The main problem of the T-30 tank remained the low rate of fire of the gun, and designers understood perfectly well that 2 shots per minute were completely insufficient for modern tank combat. The work of 2 loaders in the cramped turret space with heavy shells and charges was incredibly exhausting, and in real combat conditions crew fatigue could reduce the already low firing rate to a critical level. The solution to this problem was the T30E1 modification, on which a semi-automatic loading system was installed that substantially eased the crew's work. The principle of operation of the new system was as follows. The mechanism automatically brought the breech to the loading position. Then the rammer pushed the shell and charge from a special tray into the chamber, after which the gun returned to its original elevation angle. The loaders only had to extract the ammunition from the rack and place it on the tray, while all the heavy physical work was performed by mechanisms. In addition, an additional hatch appeared in the rear of the turret, intended for automatic ejection of spent casings outside. Massive brass cylinders weighing several kilograms flew out of the turret after a shot, freeing up space for crew work and relieving tankers of the need to manually dispose of accumulating casings. Parallel to the T30E1, there existed another modification under the designation T30E2. However, details about this variant are extremely scarce and have practically not been preserved in historical documents. Of much greater interest is the T57% project, which became the most radical attempt to solve the problem of the 155mm gun's rate of fire. On this machine, designers applied an oscillating turret with an autoloader, which was a very unusual solution for American tank building. The oscillating turret consisted of two parts, the lower one, rotating on the turret ring, and the upper one, in which the gun was mounted and which could oscillate in the vertical plane. Such a design allowed placing the autoloader in the rear turret niche and significantly increased the rate of fire. Interestingly, autoloaders subsequently became a distinctive feature of the Soviet school of tank building, while Americans for many decades preferred to keep a live loader in the crew. It was believed that a human was more reliable than a mechanism and capable of eliminating jamming or other malfunctions in combat conditions, whereas failure of an autoloader completely deprives the tank of the ability to conduct fire. The T-57 project remained experimental. However, the very idea of the oscillating turret was realized on French AMX-13 tanks, which were produced by the thousands and were in service with armies of many countries worldwide. Two T-30 prototypes didn't end their career as test machines, but served as the basis for creating a new tank. They were re-equipped as prototypes of the T-34 heavy tank, armed with a 120mm gun. This gun occupied an intermediate position between the 105mm gun of the T-29 and the 155mm monster of the T-30 itself. The 120mm shell was powerful enough to defeat any armored vehicles of a probable enemy, but at the same time significantly lighter and more compact, which allowed increasing the ammunition load and rate of fire. In fact, the T-34 became the progenitor of the gun that was subsequently installed on the serial heavy tank M103, which became a symbol of American tank power in the Cold War era. The program of American wartime heavy tanks was officially closed without producing any serial machines. Neither the T-29 nor the T-30 nor their numerous modifications went into mass production. There were several reasons for this. First, the war ended before the tanks reached combat readiness. Second, the enormous weight of the machines created unsolvable logistical problems. Bridges and roads of Europe simply weren't designed for such loads. Third, rail transportation required special platforms and took too much time. Even maximum highway speed didn't exceed 35 kilometers per hour, and on rough terrain these giants barely crawled, unable to keep up with lighter and more maneuverable machines. Nevertheless, the 6 built T-30 prototypes served enormous service to American tank building. 4 of them survived to our days and are preserved in various museums and on memorial sites. Tank number 1 remained at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Tank number 3 never left Detroit Arsenal. Tank number 5 can be seen in the United States Army Armored Vehicle Collection. And tank number 6 stands at Fort Jackson. These steel giants, with the most powerful guns of their time, stand frozen on pedestals as monuments to engineering genius and the ambitions of an era when designers believed that the bigger the tank and the more powerful its gun, the closer victory on the battlefield. If you like this story about the most heavily armed American tank of World War II, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new episodes. Write in the comments about which tank or other combat vehicle you'd like to hear about next time, and we'll definitely tell the most interesting stories from the world of armored vehicles.